All right. So the first question is from Brenda, and she asks, what is your opinion of Urolithin A and Berberine for weight loss? So both of these supplements have been used for, or are used for a number of different reasons. And we've talked a bit about Berberine before. We haven't talked much about Urolithin A. So we'll definitely kind of start from the beginning here and explain what each of these are, and then general physiological effects. And then we'll talk about whether each of them are a good option or are a good solution for losing weight. So just kind of big picture wise, each of these are polyphenols or polyphenol derivatives. So berberine is a polyphenol found in a number of different herbs. One of the main ones is golden seal. And then urolithin A is a polyphenol metabolite, where basically it's produced from bacteria when they metabolize certain polyphenols that are found in a number of different foods. And each of these are used as supplements to help with a number of things. They're said to help with mitochondrial function. They're said to help with blood sugar regulation. They're said to help with, in this case, weight loss and a number of other things. So we'll kind of be digging into that. And I guess we'll start with berberine first, and then we'll dig into urolithin A after. Mike, do you want to go ahead and start us off there?
Sure. So berberine, for me, both these compounds are kind of a mixed bag. So with berberine, the first thing let's actually talk about is pros, because there are pros to it and when it can be used, possibly, and we can talk about what the cons are. So the first pro is that berberine, like urolithin A, which we'll talk about in a second, isn't really absorbed well. So they're even trying to structurally modify the berberine now to make dihydroberberine so that it's more absorbable, but regular berberine isn't absorbed quite well. And this is good because when we talk about the cons, we'll see that has some toxicity for the liver. And so the next thing is the benefits of berberine inside diabetes specifically. The main one, at least from my perspective, is that it does decrease gluconeogenesis by impairing pyruvate carboxylation. So basically it impairs the process of producing glucose from amino acids and different components, which can be helpful in diabetes because gluconeogenesis, as we talked about in multiple episodes, is upregulated. And the process of having an upregulated gluconeogenesis at the liver can start to lead to insulin resistance and other problems with pancreatic beta cells and things like this over time. So lowering that can be helpful. But at the same time, how we're lowering that is really important to actually understand. And berberine isn't doing it by lowering glucagon or lowering stress. It's just going in and impairing mitochondrial function, which again, I'll talk about in a second. So separate from that, and the other thing is, again, since berberine's not really well absorbed, it may not make it in large amounts to the liver to have this effect, although only micromolar concentrations are required. So the next thing is berberine does have some antimicrobial effects, and it does have anti-inflammatory effects, and it does have microbiome shifting effects, and it can possibly function as a endotoxin antagonist in the intestine. So traditionally, a lot of cultures, a lot of alternative medicine healers over time have used berberine to treat diarrheal disorders. And I think in the sense of treating the gut, berberine actually has a bunch of benefits and can be used in short courses to help clear out the gut. However, long-term utilization, I would say, is problematic because of the toxicity components from it. So overall, in the studies, berberine triggers mucus production, which can help trigger the growth of a bacteria called Akkermansia muciniphila, which also helps improve gut integrity and lower the leakage of endotoxin across the intestine. So if you're dealing with significant gut issues, you can use berberine in conjunction with other components. These are things that I run in what I call a gut protocol to help minimize people's digestive issues over time. So in that sense, from a weight loss perspective, if you're dealing with digestive issues and LPS and these different components, endotoxin are blocking your ability to lose weight and shifting hormones, running a short course of berberine in this context may be helpful to help minimize the block on metabolism and on the shift in the hormones. But as a long-term solution, I don't think that it's, the best thing ever. Now, the reason why, and let's get into the cons. First of all, a lot of the beneficial studies on berberine where we see some benefit are in cell culture studies or in very specific contexts and circumstances. So it's important to understand when you're looking at different studies that showing that something is beneficial is how is that working? So we do want to understand that when we're looking at berberine. But when we look there's a study where they perfuse rat livers with berberine. What we see is that it actually decreases the ability of the liver to detoxify ammonia, which long-term is not good because ammonia is toxic. It also, we see that berberine can increase glycolysis, and it's increasing glycolysis because it actually decreases mitochondrial function and actually negatively impacts ATP production. So the liver is basically saying, hey, we need to upregulate glycolysis. We need to use this less efficient, less beneficial way of producing energy, which is glycolysis, because the mitochondrial metabolism is impaired with berberine. We also see shifts in favor of NADH over NAD plus with berberine utilization, which is actually not good. We want to see an increase in NAD plus and ratio to NADH. And we also see increased lactate to pyruvate ratios. So all of this is indicating that berberine is negatively impacting the mitochondrial function of the liver. So it's essentially, it is an alkaloid compound from plants. It's meant to be a defensive compound. It's meant to have antimicrobial properties. And it's also meant to deter animals from eating these particular types of plants, but there are different portions of the plants, whether that's the leaves, whether that's the roots, whether that's the stems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So berberine is a defensive compound, and it shows defensive pesticidal effects, including towards mammals. So from a gut perspective, can be helpful. From an energy metabolism perspective, not so helpful. It can lower blood glucose values, and it can shift hemoglobin A1C values by blocking gluconeogenesis. But the mechanism by which it does that probably isn't the most ideal, and there's probably better ways to go about it. In terms of use cases, I think short-term utilization to clear out the gut could be helpful. Long-term use, probably not ideal overall, although it's not highly absorbed. So I think that the risk of toxicity is decreased if you're using regular berberine. As dihydroberberine may be a little bit different because its modification allows it to be more absorbed. And in terms of the overall picture, the context for weight loss, I don't really think that it's going to make a massive difference in somebody's weight loss, besides like getting your foundation right with diet, movement, sleep, dialing in hormones and things like that. That, in my experience with all the clients that I've worked with, hands down the most effective way to dial in weight loss. These little niche things that we see from podcasters and health gurus of, berberine, urolithin A, these are the things that are going to make a difference to your weight loss. You need to supplement this now. I haven't seen that make a massive difference in people's weight loss. It's mostly foundational stuff, and these things are maybe helpful for very specific use cases like gut problems.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a great summary overall. I think even to zoom out a little bit, and you were kind of alluding to this, when we're talking about polyphenols, most of them serve a purpose as defense chemicals. And so what that means is they tend to kill pests and microbes, bacteria and fungus. But a lot of them can also be there through the same mechanisms toxic to us. And as you were saying, that's essentially what we're seeing with this toxicity, and you see it play out in a handful of different places. You see it play out in the liver. We also see it play out in the most basic of our functions and needs, which is energy production. So berberine is well known as a mitochondrial toxin, where it has a pretty strong inhibition at complex 1 of the electron transport chain, which basically means that any food that you're taking in, you're not going to be converting it to energy as effectively. This is all assuming, as you were saying, this is all assuming that it's getting absorbed. So this is when you're looking at berberine inside the human body, not in the gut. Although it does have similar effects in the gut too, just against bacteria and microbes. But so when it's absorbed, berberine has these effects. And as you were saying, that's how it can help, so to speak, with lowering blood sugar. There's some inhibition of gluconeogenesis, and there's also basically a wasting of glucose that happens, because when you're not able to run that glucose all the way through mitochondrial respiration, you're forced to rely on glycolysis to produce energy. And that causes us to use up a ton of glucose and produce more lactate, as you were saying, while also lowering that NAD to NADH ratio. And then what we're left with is less energy, but less glucose. And so, yes, you can see that work by basically poisoning the mitochondria, but that is not the way that we want to be lowering our blood sugar, right? We want to lower our blood sugar by actually improving our utilization of it, improving our insulin sensitivity, as opposed to just poisoning basically our engines so that we're wasting the glucose. So when absorbed, berberine has this toxic effect. And so because of that, as you're saying, not really a great idea in most cases, except for if you're using it to improve gut health, where it has been shown to have various benefits. And the main ones are by reducing fungus and bacteria. And those are not small, those are not insignificant effects. Those can dramatically impact other areas whether we're talking liver function, brain function, immune function, or weight loss. So by improving the state of the gut, berberine can be helpful. Part of the issue, as you were saying, with supplementing is now people are supplementing with incredibly high doses and also trying to convert it into forms that are more absorbable, as if that's where the benefit is coming from. But really, that's where the harm is coming from something like berberine. If you're just using it for the gut effects, then, as you were saying, Mike, using it short or moderate term could be fine, especially in more moderate doses, and especially not in the forms that are absorbed more effectively, because we actually don't want it to be absorbed. And this is something we've talked about in the Hormesis series. We've talked about in a few different gut episodes, where the benefit of polyphenols in general, in most foods, is that they are toxic to microbes and they help to keep the bacterial population down or fungal population down. And they also tend to be selective, right? They tend to selectively affect the more harmful microbes. And so that's really where their benefit is coming from. And there's so much confusion in the research, especially with hormesis, where these things that are toxic, like known to be mitochondrially toxic, and then cause all these defensive reactions, are said to be beneficial because they're supposed to make you stronger and they create new mitochondria and they increase autophagy. And in reality, these are just defensive reactions to something that's toxic or poisonous, and not actually a way to improve our health. And this has all gotten conflated to where now people are trying to take massive doses of polyphenols to do something like lose weight, when in reality the benefit is mostly just through supporting gut health, and we really want to minimize how much is being absorbed in that mitochondrially toxic effect. And so that would be, that's kind of the big picture thoughts with berberine, and urolithin A really is pretty parallel in terms of its effects. So there's a little bit less identified as far as its toxicity, so to speak, in terms of the mitochondria, but there's definitely some indication of impairment in electron transportation function, so impairment in energy production, lowering of ATP, and increasing in things like AMP kinase, NRF2, all of the same hormetic pathways that not only does berberine activate, but so does cigarette smoke, so does mercury, so does any sort of intense stress. And these are the things that are supposed to be beneficial. People will point to these things as if this is a reason to consume these compounds at high doses, but in reality, as we're getting to, these are just toxic effects here. And so, the very kind of brief situation with urolithin A is similar, where we're having some mitochondrial toxicity and some beneficial gut effects at the same time. Antimicrobial effects, anti-inflammatory effects in the gut, improving the integrity of the gut barrier, reducing endotoxin release from bacteria. So there's a number of benefits in the gut for urolithin A, but again, we're having those mitochondrial toxic effects. And there are some other ones that I'll get to in a moment, but the kind of summary here is this is not really something that we want to be getting in large doses. But Mike, I'll let you go ahead and dig in further, and then we'll discuss some other effects.
That's great, Jay. What I would add here, and I want to set some context for a lot of these different compounds before I jump into urolithin A. Pretty much all of these plant compounds and these different components are a mixed bag. And the reason why is because they don't just have one unifying effect. They have multiple different effects on multiple different pathways across the body. And it's important to understand, are they absorbed? Are they not absorbed? Are they modified by the microbiome? Do they shift the microbiome? What's their effect on inflammatory pathways? What's their effect on mitochondria? What's their effect on hormones? What's their effect on enzymatic systems? And so you can have a compound like urolithin A or berberine that have beneficial effects in some context because of their mechanisms in different areas, but then have problematic effects in other areas because of how they affect these systems. So if you're looking at berberine or urolithin A on some inflammatory enzymes and signaling and things like this, maybe it has some benefit, or maybe in the microbiome it has some benefit. But then when you see its effects in the mitochondria, it's different. So it's not, a lot of times compounds are promoted in a black and white circumstance of this is either good or this is either bad. And what winds up happening, what you need to understand is what is its effect in these different contexts? What's it being used for? What's that individual's context? And what are the risk versus reward of the compounds based on all of these different factors? And so that's why it's not such a cut and dry answer as this is either a good thing or a bad thing. And a lot of times the component here that I think is important that we're trying to add is just some nuance to the picture so that people can understand that like there actually is some negative effects to some of these compounds. And even though they're not pharmaceuticals, they actually do have side effects, and they can have some negative downstream effects because of how they're working. So it's just because it's natural doesn't necessarily mean it's good. I think that natural fallacy is present here. And so that brings me into urolithin A. First things first is not everybody produces urolithin A. I think it's only like 40% of people, at least from what we understand now, actually produce urolithin A. And this is urolithin A is produced from tannins, specifically elagitannins and ellagic acid from foods in our diet. So this is things like raspberries, pomegranate, which is one of the highest sources of the elagitannins, and blackberries. And then basically the bacteria convert one of these elagitannins into urolithin A, but then there's also urolithin B and urolithin C, and conversion into urolithin A is microbiome specific, which means it's person specific. So most people, the majority of people are not necessarily converting to urolithin A. The next thing is, like berberine, urolithin A is some of the different urolithins are not super absorbable, and then the urolithin A gets absorbed through the intestinal tract and immediately sulfated and glucuronidated, which means it's getting marked for detoxification to pass in the urine. So the body is already trying to minimize some of these different components. Now, the effects of urolithin A are varied. So in some of the rat studies, which I think is where the hype around the weight loss came from, was like, oh, it increases brown adipose tissue and energy expenditure and uncoupling and this and that because it increases conversion of T4 to T3. However, this is in mice studies or rat studies. And as we talked about in other areas, human and rat brown adipose tissue concentrations and the energy expended through brown adipose tissue is very different. So this may not necessarily directly apply to humans because of the change in brown adipose tissue. The next thing is there is a study in humans showing benefits in skeletal muscle mitochondrial function. Although the ATP production was insignificantly different, the major difference was the change in walking distance in this study, and then some of the skeletal muscle function, which was determined through indirect metrics. But the study was also funded by a supplement manufacturer, so it's a little bit questionable around the objectivity of the study. The next thing is there does seem to be some specific studies where we see benefits for mitophagy, which is basically repair of mitochondria through an autophagic process where the damaged portion of mitochondria get degraded by different components in the cell. And also we see increases in mitochondrial biogenesis and increased production of mitochondrial proteins in response to urolithin A. However, the question is, how is this working is extremely important, because if you're damaging mitochondrial function and you're creating a response from that, it may not necessarily always be a good thing. The other thing is urolithin A does seem to lower some inflammatory values in humans. That was in one of these studies promoted by a supplement company where we saw lowered CRP values and adjustments in reactive oxygen species. So I would say overall, we have some studies where we see some negative effects in the mitochondria, and we have other studies where we see some beneficial effects. Some of them may have some bias, and then some of them are in animal studies. So overall, I think urolithin A, it's kind of a mixed bag, and it's really going to depend on what area you're specifically looking at. What I would say, though, is I think that raspberries, pomegranates, and blackberries are great things to incorporate in the diet from a carbohydrate perspective and from providing different vitamins and minerals and also shifting the microbiome in a beneficial way. As an example, one of the elagitannins in pomegranate, punicalagin, increases an enzyme called peroxidase 1 that can have some benefits inside the arteries. So again, this is one of those things where some of these compounds have off-target benefits that aren't being discussed that may like have a significant effect in these very specific circumstances and areas. So I look at things in this fashion. What's the effect of this compound in this particular area? And then look across multiple areas to get an overarching picture. As far as supplementing urolithin A for weight loss, I'm doubtful that it's going to make a massive shift in somebody's weight loss more than what you would do with getting diet under control, getting lifestyle factors under control. So again, am I with clients saying, hey, you need to go on this stack of urolithin A and ginger and berberine and all these components so that you can so that you can lose weight? No, what I'm saying is let's get your diet under control. Let's dial in your calories, your macronutrients, the food sources, the micronutrients, and then see what's going on with hormones and fix those things. And then that's how I'm moving the needle for people's weight, not with these compounds. If I wanted to shift somebody's gut microbiome, then maybe I would use urolithin A and berberine. But at this point in time, I'd probably just say have some pomegranate juice or eat some pomegranates or add some pomegranate powder extract into your orange juice if you really want to do something like this, instead of just take this like high dose urolithin A supplement.
Sure. And when it comes to manipulating the microbiome, sometimes we do need things that are stronger than just
Yep.
pomegranate juice. But and so these might fall into that category. I think what you're kind of getting at with zooming out, and whether it's talking weight loss or any other effect, is that there is an inherent reductionism that always goes on when people point to the effects of these compounds. It's, hey, this compound induces autophagy, and we know autophagy is good, this compound is good. Or let's look at it in this area, let's look at it in the blood vessels, let's look at it in the liver, let's look at it in the gut. And what there isn't is a cohesive understanding of recognizing the interaction between the entire organism and the compound. It's not a situation where it just has a bunch of random effects that are totally unrelated. The effects are all directly related, right? There are certain functions of this compound and interactions chemically and physically that lead to certain effects. So the effects in the gut, and this is again the same with nearly all or the vast majority of polyphenols and a lot of plant compounds, is the effects on the gut are beneficial because it's toxic to certain bacteria. Those same toxic effects are generally why we don't want to be consuming large amounts and absorbing these. It's not like it's having a random effect in the gut and a random effect in the mitochondria. These are both directly related in terms of the impact of these compounds. So I think that's worth mentioning. Of course, there are some other specific things too, right? For example, when it comes to urolithin A, there's some suggestion that has estrogenic effects, which of course would be concerning, something we wouldn't want to support. There are some other studies showing mild anti-estrogenic effects. So there are some unique pathways that need to be considered, but on the whole, it's, when we're talking about a mixed bag of research, it's really a mixed bag of interpretation and not putting those things together, right? We can see a drop in CRP and reactive oxygen species from urolithin A consumption, and that can be all mediated by benefits at the gut, which is something we see all the time with berberine. It's something we've talked about with metformin as well. And it was a good example, you were saying, just because these things are natural doesn't mean that they're devoid of side effects, doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider them like a pharmaceutical. And that's a really important point because so many pharmaceuticals are derived from plant compounds or are very, very similar. And metformin and berberine are well known to be very, very parallel. Like, we're operating in nearly the exact same ways where their benefits, and this is our perspective, not the general perspective, but our perspective is that generally the benefits are coming from lowering bacterial count, lowering endotoxin by beneficial effects at the gut, despite the fact that they're mitochondrially toxic, as opposed to their mitochondrial toxicity being somehow responsible for their benefits.